so there has never been a more obvious sell.
There's a huge edge to be gained by looking into things like this.
With the hype, it's only going one way. He's still too cheap.
How can you not love fantasy football?
Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Sanctuary. It is week 2. We are here. Week 1 is in the books. It was, let's be honest, a crazy week. I think all my good teams lost and all my bad teams won. But we're here to help you for week 2 matchups. Tom, we're going to dive straight into it. We're starting with the biggest game of the week. The highest over-under, potentially 2 of the best quarterbacks in the league. This feels super exciting. Are you just starting everyone in this matchup, quite frankly?
I mean, this is going to be the chalk. You look, one of the things that you do when you start talking about DFS matchups or you start looking for where your easy start sits are going to come is look at which games have the highest over-under. And Kansas City against Jacksonville, it just screams points in a way which, hopefully delivers. Last week, I don't think, with Travis Kelce sitting, I don't think we saw anything that wasn't expected. Marcus Valdes-Scantling ran the most routes. Sky Moore was in the slot plenty. The only kind of real surprise was that Noah Gray was outplayed by Blake Bell, really. Everything else kind of totted up. The lack of the Chiefs' running game was slightly concerning in some ways. I think if you need a reason to hit pause on anyone, Pacheco is probably that, but he did have 5 missed tackles on 8 rush attempts, which is very encouraging. And he out-targeted J.D. McKissick 4-2. So there's positives to be had there. I think in terms of players on the Jacksonville side of things, I mean, both these quarterbacks are in my DFS write-up, which if you want to read that, you can join Fantasy Sanctuary, choose the Golden Deck Chair package, works out less than the price of coffee a week. But Trevor Lawrence looked fantastic. He was 4 of 4 in the red zone. He had 3 completed passes of 15 or more yards. And that's what we talked about in the offseason. But you want to see this Jags offense unlock the downfield passing game. And they really seem to do that. Travis Etienne, I mean, I was on the Tank Bigsby tank. We were all aboard on that. And I don't think Etienne's usage was so strong that I'm completely worried about what it means for Tank Bigsby later on in the season. But for now, he should absolutely be starting Travis Etienne. I mean, he had, I lost the stat I had in front. Oh, there we go. 86% route participation, 16% target share, 53% of the rush attempts. And, if you need something to hang your hat on to keep faith in Tank Bigsby in redraft, it was that he did get the goal line work down inside the red zone, and that's where his touchdown came from. So, yeah, I think you can start pretty much everyone apart from Christian Kirk unless you really need to. He played in 97% of 3 wide receiver formations, but only 18% of other formations. So he only played 60% of the snaps, well behind Zay Jones at 88%, Calvin Ridley at 81%. And Christian Kirk is going to have better days closer to what he delivered last year. But right now it feels like that's going to be really tricky to decipher. So I'm sitting Kirk until I see differently.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this Jaguars offense. I feel like I've been talking up for about 6 months, and it was so pleasing to see it look like everything I'd wanted it to be during the offseason. I really like Etienne's usage last week. I'm not a big Etienne guy. I've been kind of talking him down through the offseason, but I was really impressed with the volume of work and the pass catching work that he was also got, because that was part of the worry with Tank Bigsby being such a good big bodied pass catcher in college. With the Kirk usage, I think he's definitely going to have spike weeks. He's going to have weeks where, he is that underneath option. He can be used down the seam, out the slot. But the fact he's running behind Zay Jones and got on the field on 1-2 wide receiver set last week, and that was when Calvin Ridley was having a breather. So, yeah, I don't think I can, certainly in any managed league or in DFS, play Christian Kirk unless it's kind of a flyer. The thing that I know that you've said all offseason, the Kansas City receivers, there's not going to be one. It's going to be, a random collection of people each week. I'm really, really intrigued by Rashee Rice. Okay. I think that he showed last week in limited sample size that he was probably the most reliable. He is incredibly raw. He ran 3 routes in college, and he still needs to round out that route tree. But he is a big-bodied athlete that's good after the catch. And if he can start to round out that game, I'd love to see what he can become in this Kansas City offense. So yeah, if you're looking for a sneaky under the radar buy, whether it be redraft or indeed Dynasty, I think Rashee Rice is the guy to go and grab.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, like if you're looking for ways to attack this game for DFS, Mahomes and Kelsey is always going to be semi-popular. I would imagine the easiest stack for a lot of people will be putting some form of Mahomes, Kelsey, Ridley, or Lawrence, Kelsey, Ridley in, and just leaving it as that. But if you want to add Rashee Rice in for 3.8K, that definitely helps with the salary that you've spent elsewhere. So I wouldn't worry about doing that. I think that there's upside. I mean, the big barrier for Rashee Rice is, yeah, he only played 30% of the snaps, but it's not crazy to consider that he could easily bypass, like, Richie James, that he could get up there to sort of like be playing more even, possibly with Sky Moore, who didn't do a whole lot last week.
We've got a question from T Money Reacts in the chat. He's saying, should I trade Olave for Etienne? Etienne would then be his running back 1, or should I go for Bijan?
I'm going for Bijan. I'm making it. If the Bijan owner is worried about Tyler Allgeier's usage, which we'll get into later when we get to the Falcons, but yeah, out of the two, I would be very much more targeting Bijan than Travis Etienne, even if I do think that this week Etienne's a fine start.
Yeah, I feel like selling Olave for Etienne is probably selling a little bit low on Olave and buying a bit high on Etienne. I'd probably ward against doing that, but if you can go and get Bijan for Olave, I'd do that every day of the week. So the next matchup, as you can see, 48.5 over under. So again, expecting a decent amount of points in this one. Seattle, Detroit. Obviously, last year this was an absolute blow up. Won me quite a lot of money, Tom. Are we expecting that again this year?
It's a game which I've kind of got half an eye on at the minute. I think the Seahawks' issues with their offensive line are going to be big this week. You look at Detroit, their defensive line could be quite frisky against the Seahawks offensive line, which makes me worry about the Seahawks running game with Kenneth Walker. We saw last week it didn't look particularly special. It might be a matchup which favors Zach Charbonnet more. If they're having to get the ball out quickly because of the troubles they have with their offensive line, then perhaps they start drawing up plays for Zach Charbonnet, those screen games. We didn't see him get many touches last week at all. So possibly, but yeah, it's one of those games where you look at it on paper and you go, okay, well, I like DK Metcalf at the minute. Tyler Lockett was cleared from concussion protocol and returned to the game last week, so he didn't really miss any games. Jackson Smith-Njigba, he only played on 66% of the routes, but he tied for the team lead in targets at 22%. He had a 26% target per route run rate, so that was the best on the team, which is really positive for a guy who's playing with a cast on his wrist. So I like all those players. I think the one player that really stands out to me, well, there's two. I like Josh Reynolds. I think he's still going undervalued. Last week, he had 12 PPR points. He was second in targets on the team. He seems to have firmly taken that wide receiver 2 role for the Lions until Jameson Williams ever takes it back for himself. But also Sam Laporta, he had a really positive start. Possibly not in managed leagues. I wouldn't necessarily be doing this, but in DFS, Sam Laporta had 5 targets last week. The Seahawks have struggled against tight ends. They were dead last in fantasy points allowed to position last year. So I like that. The running backs on the Detroit side of things, I mean, David Montgomery still going $500 cheaper than Jahmyr Gibbs when Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be a part-time player for a little bit. I'll be sprinkling in a bit of David Montgomery with some of the Seahawks pass catchers this week. But yeah, it definitely looks like a prime matchup. And I think if you've got either of these quarterbacks in redraft, you can start them.
Yeah, I'm literally having this conversation. I've dropped Geno for Jared Goff in my home league, and I'm sort of gone back and forth on it about 3 times since. So, but we've got a question from one of our members in the chat. Tarek, he says, biggest debate for me this week, have to choose between Mattison, Montgomery and Kelly if Eckler sits, Goddard and Andrews. He's got 1 running back, 1 tight end and 2 flexes. So should we start with the tight ends? That feels easy. It's Andrews every day, I presume?
I mean, Andrews, it sounds like he's going to play. Baltimore beat writers were saying today that Andrews is moving around on the practice field well. But there is the squeaky wheel narrative with Dallas Goedert and Nick Sirianni. Last year, he came out after the game where Devonta Smith had 0 targets or 0 catches and was like, we have to get him more involved. And straight away, they did get him more involved the next week. So he is a coach who does lean into that. So I don't hate it, but I would be going with Andrews over Goddard. Yeah, just in terms of the running backs, I am probably going with Monty, and then it depends how confident you are that if Eckler does play, which doesn't sound likely, but you have a different option, because otherwise you might be left kicking yourself and wishing you played Madison tonight in a game where you could get a decent amount of receptions.
Yeah, I think for me, you need to play Madison. I'd go start Madison, start Monty, start Andrews, and then you've got the decision between Goddard and Kelly if Eckler plays. I think if Eckler doesn't play, then I'd go Kelly. If he does, then I'd go the other way. The other matchup, so before we go on, the Seattle side of things, we were both massive fans of Zach Charbonnet through the off-season. We thought this was going to be a split backfield, but as we can see, Kenneth Walker there, 16 touches, 18 routes. Zach Charbonnet was very much I don't even think you can call him a 1B. He was more of a 2, wasn't he? Do you expect that to continue?
Yeah, I think we're going to see more touches from him. I think the game last week got away from the Seahawks early, and because of that, they didn't get Zach Charbonnet involved. But I fully expect him to see at least sort of 7 or 8 touches this week.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. Potentially Seattle have lost both their offensive tackles. Obviously, their right tackle's gone on IR for 4 weeks, but the left tackle's also injured. If that happens, I'd expect Charbonnet to get more usage because we'll see more screens and more manufactured touches rather than just running ball between tackles as such. The next matchup, the Colts versus the Texans. I can't say Indianapolis this morning. 40 over under, but interestingly, 80% of the cash is currently on the under. So this over under is probably going to drop before kickoff. Are you touching anyone in this matchup, or is it just a stay away for you?
It's a tricky one because last week the Texans, their defensive line was just abusive against the Ravens. I mean, Will Anderson looks like an absolute game wrecker. So I think he could have quite a day himself against this Colts offensive line. I think Anthony Richardson, the one thing we talked about during the offseason was how good he was at evading sacks. But he had 4 sacks last week against the Jags, so perhaps that's not something that's going to translate fully over. But I think you can start Anthony Richardson again. I mean, he had the second most quarterback rush attempts last week with 10, only behind Daniel Jones. And the one big thing for the Colts is that Shane Steichen seems to have them playing fast, which is something that he used to have the Eagles doing. They were snapping the ball, this according to Sam Hoffman of Fantasy Pros, with 15.3 seconds left on the play clock on average, which means, the Texans, they were also playing fast. So when you get 2 teams who've been playing fast, that tends to bring a decent amount of fantasy points. There is no chance, though, that I'm going near any of these Colts running backs. I think that they're an absolute nightmare situation, which I don't want any piece of. I don't mind Michael Pittman. We saw last week that he almost came close to a 100-yard game as well as getting a touchdown. Nico Collins in particular is somebody that I'll be writing up for the DFS column, which will be on Fantasy Sanctuary Discord later today or early tomorrow. He's $4,800 on DraftKings, led the team with 11 targets, 80 yards, 14 PPR points. But yeah, I mean, what do you think about Dameon Pierce? Because he didn't look particularly good against the Ravens. He had like 3.5 yards per carry, 38 yards total. But he was out there running a bit more, and we saw Mike Boone seem to be the RB2 as opposed to Singletary.
Yeah, it was basically, we had this off-season and pre-season where it was Pierce is going to be the workhorse, Pierce is going to be the workhorse. And it's just rolled straight back into what he was last year. There's the complimentary back. Mike Boone was getting the majority of the receiving work. And it's meant that Dameon Pierce is, let's call it what it is. He's a volume-based RB2 that is going to get you RB2 points purely based off volume and not really do anything more than that. Like, yeah, there might be the odd boom week if he scores a touchdown or 2, but he's not going to win you weeks. He's not going to lose you weeks, and he's never going to feel particularly great if you're putting him in any sort of lineup or any sort of DFS contest. So for me, I just don't touch him. I agree with you. The guy that I'm really interested in is Nico Collins. I was slow to him this offseason, but if you're talking unrealized air yards, and I've got a few different stats and things that I've been working in the last few days about basically breakout wide receivers after bad weeks, and Nico Collins is screaming that he's going to be the player that kind of potentially breaks out. So I think he could be a really interesting guy at some point, whether it's this week or next. I think he's going to score a lot of points. We're going to dive across next to Chicago versus Tampa. Obviously, interesting results. I think Chicago were a hell of a lot worse last week than everybody expected, and Tampa came back with a rather surprising win against the Vikings, a 41.5-point over-under. Are there any parts of this matchup that you're particularly intrigued by?
You did a great video today on our channel, about Justin Fields and the fact, he is desperate for a good week. I don't think there's anybody in the NFL who needs a good week as much as Justin Fields does, because the pitchforks are out. I think the pressure is going to build. There's no good vibes around the team that we expected not to be good this year, but we expected them to be slightly more functional. Is this passing game going to be at all useful this year? Because last week, Darnell Mooney got there, but I doubt the Bears are going to drop back to pass 52 times per game. 15 of Fields' 37 passes went to running backs. DJ Moore had only 2 targets on back-to-back plays and then didn't have another target for the rest of the game. And yes, Jair Alexander was on him. But if you can't cope with your number one wide receiver seeing good coverage, then you are going to constantly struggle in the NFL. There are a lot of good cornerbacks, and there are a lot of teams with more than one good cornerback who can remove one option from the play. Chase Claypool seems dead and buried. That experiment seems to be over. So when I look at the Bears side of things, I think you can still start Khalil Herbert. Roschon Johnson's usage all seemed to come later on in the game. It didn't seem to start early on. So I've got some ray of hope for Khalil Herbert. In terms of DFS, though, I think for this game, I'm fading pretty much everyone on the Bears side of it. In terms of the Bucs side of things, I do quite like Rachaad White. I think, he's a horribly inefficient player. He had 2.3 yards per carry last week. Sean Tucker had 3.0. But what Rachaad White can do is catch the ball, and he's not incredible at it, but he's probably about average to slightly above average at it. Last week, the Bears defense allowed a league-leading 103 receiving yards to Packers running backs. So that feels like an area where Rachaad White can exploit things. Mike Evans, he had 10 targets, was wide receiver 13 last week. So I don't mind that. How do you feel about Chris Godwin? Because I know you had a couple of stats about him this week.
Yeah, I'm genuinely concerned about Chris Godwin. We talked about in the offseason, and I wrote a couple of articles about Chris Godwin talking about how his fantasy value is so kind of sustainable because of the amount of manufactured touches he's got. You look over the last few years, he's averaged almost 3 screen targets per game. And last week, the Bucs ran 2 screens and he got 1 target. I know that doesn't sound much, but if you're basically reducing his floor by 3 points a week just by taking those screen targets away, the fact that they're also pushing the ball downfield more, I think fits more into Mike Evans than Chris Godwin. So yeah, I'm not panicking yet on Chris Godwin, but I'm definitely getting there. I'm really concerned that this game, I don't really want to touch it. I agree with you about DJ Moore. Yeah, he had Joe Alexander, but I'm sorry, if you're an offensive coordinator and you can't scheme up a way to get a receiver away from a corner, you can use motion, use stacks, bring him into a bunch formation. There's all sorts of inventive ways you can free him up, and yet they've not done it. The Saints moved Chris Olave into the backfield on Sunday so that they could get him a free release. Why can't Chicago do that with DJ Moore?
If Sean McVay can manage this with Puka Nacua, it's not that difficult. Use motion consistently, keep them in motion at the point of snap. Don't motion them across and then stop. let the defense have time to realign and then play it. But also Justin Fields, like, he had 59 rushing yards last week, which saved his week. But he took 4 sacks for 27 yards. So, like, it's always going to be this case with Justin Fields. He doesn't let go of the ball. He has plays that are open. He doesn't trust what he sees in front of him. And it's 7,600 on DraftKings. That's a lot more difficult when you start looking at some of the players around who just play the game safer in terms of how they take sacks, but also have higher ceilings in terms of what they're willing to do with the ball in their hands.
Yeah, absolutely. We got a question from one of our members, Lewis, saying that he's going to keep playing Sean Tucker until he accidentally hits on the game. Are you buying into that philosophy?
I'm just not quite sure what Sean Tucker hitting will translate to in this Bucs offense. Will it translate to one touchdown and 40 yards? Will that be a day where it hits? And at price, I don't know. I mean, possibly in cash if you're able to slam in a load of studs at the same time. But maybe we can talk about that one after the show, Lewis.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing as well is that you got on the screen here that the average depth of target for Justin Fields at the weekend was shocking. It's basically Desmond Ridder with better PR, isn't it? And I think that unless Justin Fields is going to start pushing the ball downfield, we saw last year his ADOT was absolutely wild, the amount he was pushing the ball downfield, and he's just not doing it at the moment. So yeah, I'm very concerned, and yeah, if you've not checked out the video that I released earlier today, go and check it out because it might be a little bit spicy, but I'm genuinely wanting rid of any dynasty share I've got. After the massive game that was last week with Miami and the Chargers, they've now come to town with a less exciting matchup with Tennessee. Are you rolling with as many Chargers as you can after such a good week last week?
Yeah, I mean, this one, it feels too easy to just go back to the well on certain things. I mean, the Titans allowed the second most fantasy points to slot receivers in week one, only behind the Chargers, and that was because Tyreek Hill just kept destroying them from there. So I'm completely fine with that. I think, Justin Herbert wasn't quite unleashed in the way which we might have hoped. We wanted to see him really forcing the ball downfield more to bring that average depth of target up that I definitely banged on about all offseason. Last year it was 6.4, which ranked 53rd amongst 55 starters. Week one, it was 7.2, which ranked 15th amongst starters. So we're definitely seeing that be more positive. The Chargers, they play fast. They play the third most offensive plays in week one, and they did at a really fast rate of play as well. So I think you can start all them. I think Josh Kelly is definitely going to be in play, and I think he'll be one of the most popular plays of the week if Austin Eckler misses out, which it sounds like he will. I mean, Austin Eckler was on Matt Harmon's podcast saying that people should go and roster Josh Kelly. That's one of those situations where when a player is telling you to do something, you probably want to take notice of it. In terms of the Titans side of things, I mean, Ryan Tannehill was just awful. So I think it's very difficult to have faith in that. DeAndre Hopkins hasn't practiced for the last 2 days, but DeAndre Hopkins doesn't practice a lot anyway. I'm sure it's pissing Mike Vrabel off, but DeAndre Hopkins is just not known for his work ethic in training. The running back position is interesting, though. I think that last week we saw Tajay Spears get the start ahead of Derrick Henry and then outsnap Derrick Henry slightly. I think he had more work slightly in the receiving game. Derrick Henry had a couple of screens, though, because if you want Derrick Henry to play in the receiving game, the screen game is absolutely what you need him to be doing. And I do think that we've not seen enough yet to make me have any faith in this Chargers run defense. It was awful over the last couple of years. Miami didn't really attack that because they were having such success with Tyreek Hill. So perhaps this is a game where the Titans go back to what they know they can lean on and go and just lean on Derrick Henry for one of those big performances.
Maybe. I can't get on board with the Titans offense because, as you said, Tannehill was absolutely abysmal. I don't love DeAndre Hopkins outside of the fact he's getting loads of volume. I just feel like he's not adding anything to that volume. And Derrick Henry playing 47% of snaps was downright scary. So I'm really concerned. I personally don't think I can touch this offense. Yeah, there'll be elements of the Chargers that I can sprinkle in. I think the really interesting thing with the Chargers that probably we've brushed over slightly is they were top 5 in terms of both plays per game, but also pace. I think it's really interesting that if they are going to be that high tempo offense, and we've got these potential superstar quarterback and all these options, it could mean that we can start everyone from the Chargers and everyone can eat kind of thing. And got a couple of questions in the chat though, Tom. So first of all, from John LaRue, do I trade AJ Brown and Burks for Cup and Puka?
I wouldn't be, and I think obviously Cup and Burks are both dealing with injuries, but Burks is healthier than Cup is. But also, if you get Cup and Puka back out there, you're going to have to decide which one or both. Can you start both of them? I don't think that Puka Nacua is going to necessarily get 15 targets in a game when Cooper Kupp is out there. So, yeah, for me, it's an easy one. I'd be staying with AJ Brown and Treylon Burks.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And then the other question, in a full PPR, which two would you go with? London, Addison, Gabe Davis, and Shaheed. For me, it's London and Addison.
For me, it's Addison and Gabe Davis. I don't think I can start Drake London this week. I just, yeah. Well, I mean, we'll get to the Falcons in a minute, but yeah, it's not a matchup I'm particularly wild about.
That's fair. And before we move on from this matchup, last thing, if Austin Eckler is out and it's Josh Kelly's backfield, how high do you think he'll end up ranking in kind of a running back position?
I think you're talking about a top 15 running back. That feels kind of fair. I mean, I've been out on DeAndre Swift quite a lot this summer. I think it's easier for me to go with Kelly and to just wait and take that little bit of extra information as the weekend unfolds. I think that Rashad Penny could have a reasonable night tonight and is probably the only Eagles running back I'd start.
Yeah, I don't think I can start DeAndre Swift until I know exactly what type of role he's going to be playing. So yeah, I'd go with Kelly personally there. The next matchup, we talked about Atlanta. We're going to dive into it now. So it's a 40.5 over-under against Green Bay. The Falcons, one of the slowest offenses, the second fewest plays last week. Is there anything that's hinting towards this offense finally going to use all three of its kind of potential high-drafted superstars?
Like, there is no offense that's more frustrating in fantasy football than the Atlanta Falcons. And Arthur Smith can, he can say all he wants, but, they're not trying to play fantasy football. They don't care about fantasy football. But, dude, you took 3 assets in the top 10 of consecutive drafts, and you are not utilizing them properly. Kyle Pitts is not being utilized properly. Drake London should not be getting 0 targets in a game. And then Bijan Robinson is the only one who is being utilized properly. And Arthur Smith is going to go down kicking and screaming, raging about people saying that we just don't understand what he's trying to do. They're just wanting to win games. If Arthur Smith wanted to win games, then it's absolute negligence that they didn't go out this offseason and get a better option than Desmond Ridder, who they do not trust to throw the ball. Yes, he completed he's safe. He's not turning over the ball. And there's an element of that. Okay, great. Well, that helps you not lose games. But 53% of his completions last week occurred behind the line of scrimmage. So are you really doing that much with the ball? Would you rather? I mean, there's a gulf between Desmond Ridder doing that and Jameis Winston going 30 for 30. But I find that I can't trust anyone in this Falcons passing game until we see it. I think you can absolutely start Bijan Robinson. You could probably start Tyler Algier as well. The Packers allowed a league-leading 11 receptions to running backs last week, so it's an area which Desmond Ridder might enjoy some success. On the Packers sides of things, it doesn't sound like Christian Watson will be healthy. Aaron Jones could possibly miss out. If that is the case, I won't be playing A.J. Dillon. I just don't think that A.J. Dillon's actually a good running back at this point.
I agree. I think from a dynasty perspective, I really like Drake London and Kyle Pitts as buy lows if you can go and get them. But yeah, if Watson's not playing, if Aaron Jones is not playing, maybe the answer is just avoid this matchup. As much as Jordan Love really impressed me last week, and I think that he's a great buy for Dynasty. I think, really impressive pocket mobility, really impressive processing ability, and think that he could be a great asset moving forward. The next matchup we're going to talk about, the Vegas against Buffalo. Reasonable over-under, 47.5. I know Buffalo are tied for the highest implied team total on the week. An awful lot of money going on the under, though, Tom. 89% of cash currently on the under. Are you excited by some of these Bills, or do you think this could be a one-sided drubbing after they lost to the mighty Jets last week?
The Bills have got to come out and they know that they can't afford another bad performance here. And you look back over the last few years, and your Jets have had Josh Allen's number at times. They've kept him, down to very minimal passing games, and he's only really succeeded with his legs. What kind of would be nice is to see them come out really passing. Like, I'm interested to see where the Marcus Peters shadows Stephon Diggs. That feels like there's potential for a fun matchup there. I think you absolutely start Diggs. Dalton Kincaid, he had 76% route participation, but his ADOT was terrible. 1.5 yards ADOT, you can see it on the screen there, is dreadful. I think if you've got James Cook, you probably can play him as well. It was disappointing to see him come out of the game for Damian Harris at times, but also Latavius Murray. He was in there for the 2-minute drill, which insinuates that the guy they trust the most for possibly pass protection is Latavius Murray, a guy who's been around the league for a long time. The Raiders, they allowed 11 running back receptions last week. So, this Raiders defense, it's not going to be great. They had success against a Broncos team, but I think we know that over the course of the season, it's just going to look more and more miserable. The Bills, I'd be starting Josh Allen, Diggs, possibly Kincaid. If you took Kincaid where you did, you probably need to start him or at least have some faith in it. Gabe Davis, I'd start him in this game. It feels like the matchup where Gabe Davis can have a really good week, and I'm definitely guilty of saying that a little too often. Josh Jacobs, you start him. Breece Hall absolutely got loose against the Bills on several occasions, so I think Josh Jacobs will have a better week than the kind of rubbish 3.5 yards per carry or something that he had last week. The one area that really stands out to me from a DFS point, though, is if Jacoby Myers misses out with concussion, which sounds very possible, Hunter Renfrow, who had 0 targets last week, he only played 13 snaps, but if he moves into that slot role, we saw how much Jacoby Myers was able to feed there from Jimmy Garoppolo last week. If the Bills are looking to take Davante Adams out of the game, then Hunter Renfrow could have a decent day.
Yeah. Any interest in the two Bills tight ends? I see on DK there, 3.3K for Kincaid, 3.1 for Knox. Both of them over 80% of snaps on the field, running decent route participation. Do you think they could be reasonably decent, cheaper tight ends this week?
I think they're definitely in play. When you consider what we thought Dalton Kincaid was coming into this season, it was the down the field seam stretcher kind of player. And last week we just didn't see that, but they seem to be making a concentrated effort to try and actually get him involved often and get the ball in his hands because they see him as a playmaker. So if they can get him a little bit more loose this week against a weaker defense, then yeah, perhaps it's Kincaid week. Dawson Knox, you're always just praying for a touchdown when it comes to Dawson Knox. When he doesn't score touchdowns, he's pretty useless, really.
Perfect. And whilst you're here, if you're watching, make sure you're hitting that thumbs up button, but also give us a subscribe if this is the first time, tuning in. Welcome. And if you're liking what you're doing, you want to see more of Tom's DFS content, hit that join button. You can join the Golden Deck Chair, get access to all of Tom's DFS write-ups and so much more.
And also, if you're here, though, and you've got questions, if you're watching us on replay, leave your questions in the comments. We will answer every single question, no matter what it's about with startups, all that sort of stuff. We will get to them. Sorry, Rich.
No, not at all. The exciting matchup of the week, whilst I was doing the prep for this show, I told you there is one player that I'm very, very excited to be starting this week. Baltimore, Cincinnati, 46.5 over under. Again, 97% of the cash is on the under. So maybe dropping that number down a little bit as you get to kick off. Tom, Are you excited about any of these guys starting this week?
It'd just be nice for one game if the Ravens could come into this matchup healthy. Like out of the last 5 games that these two teams have played, Lamar Jackson's only played in 2 of them. We saw in the playoffs last year, Marlon Humphrey was out, Marcus Williams, I think he played, but we were missing maybe Kyle Hamilton. And you go back and it's just been miserable. I'm not making excuses because you have to win the divisional games. But this week you look at it and Ravens going to be missing Pro Bowl left tackle Ronnie Stanley. They're going to be missing Tyler Linderbaum, who had PFF's highest grade at center last week. And they're also going to be missing Marcus Williams with a torn pec, who they paid a lot of money to be their star playmaking safety. So it looks like this one could develop into a shootout. I'm not interested in the running backs on either side of this game. I think Joe Mixon, it doesn't look like he's lost a huge amount of work to either any of Chase Brown, Chris Evans, Travion Williams. It feels like they're going to mix in at times, but nobody's really stolen that. But I'm just not sure that Mixon's going to have a great deal of success against the Ravens defensive line that really shut Dameon Pierce down at times last week. But yeah, in terms of a passing game, load up on wide receivers, load up on Mark Andrews if he plays at 6,300. That feels like a very friendly price for him. Mark Andrews had plenty of touchdowns in this matchup over the last few years. But I'm not playing Gus Edwards or Justice Hill or definitely not Melvin Gordon.
No, but the guy that I'm really excited about this week, T. Higgins. I think for me, T. Higgins goes one of 2 ways. He had an insane amount of unrealized air yards, 151 air yards last week, 8 targets, but didn't get a reception at all. We've seen all the talk in the week that this means that the Bengals are going to move on from him. They're not close to a contract. And I think that basically, if T. Higgins doesn't have a good week this week, I think he's probably going to struggle for the rest of the year, because I think that what the Bengals are going to do is that squeaky wheel game and say, no, T, you're still part of the offense. You're still part of our future. And they're going to force feed him the ball against the Baltimore's banged up secondary. So I think that T. Higgins could have an absolutely monster week. And I fear, Tom, for your Ravens a little bit this week, because I feel like the Bengals could come back with a bump.
Yeah, I think so much of it depends on how healthy is Joe Burrow. Is Joe Burrow's issues? I mean, last week he looked rusty. The Ravens looked rusty. These are 2 teams who didn't play many starters at all in the offseason. So there was definitely an element of that. But if you're looking for correlations, T. Higgins and Zay Flowers feels like an absolute perfect one to lock in on DraftKings. I mean, Zay Flowers in his debut led the team in targets, had 3 red zone targets. I know you put out some stats today that were really good about how many design plays he had. And sometimes that can go a little too far where you end up in the Kadarius Toney basket. But it was really positive to see him come out and have a great debut.
Yeah, and also, I talked about it, I can't remember when, but at some point, I think Monday maybe, the interesting thing with the J.K. Dobbins injury is that I don't necessarily think that the Ravens are going to go, right, let's get our running backs involved in the passing game. I think they're going to go, right, Zay Flowers, he's going to be our jet sweep guy, he's going to be our screen guy, and it means more potential targets for Zay Flowers rather than necessarily those running back targets staying with the running backs. I feel like this one could be quite a quick one. The Giants looking to bounce back after a very embarrassing game. Arizona is not a game that anyone wants. It's a 40 over under. 83% of the cash is on the under, so that over is coming down. Tom, are you starting anyone at all in this matchup in DFS?
Daniel Jones is just about cheap enough where I think you can be looking at him in cash. I don't think this game is going to lend itself to a ceiling outcome enough where I really want to attack it for tournaments in DFS. But at 6,000, I mean, we're looking for 18, 19 points. And Daniel Jones last week led the league with 13 rush attempts, 16.7 scramble rate, which also led the league, and he had 43 yards. The Cowboys defense is probably the toughest in the league, but the Cardinals definitely aren't in the same tier. So they might not put enough pressure on him where he feels obliged to do that. But the Giants do like to draw up run plays for Daniel Jones, and if he gets loose, then he can pick up a decent chunk yardage. One of the players that's kind of sneaky interesting to me is Paris Campbell. He led the team in route participation at 75%, played out of the slot for the vast majority. And we have seen that can be a really useful role in Daniel Jones' offenses. So I kind of wonder whether he's worth a speculative play this week in DFS. The only other thing of note, like it was just baffling to see Trey McBride behind Zach Ertz, and massively so. Like Zach Ertz, I think, led the team in targets or was tied for the team lead in targets. So that one, I mean, Trey McBride should be absolutely the player the Cardinals are trying to develop. But yeah, here we are with Zach Ertz, an old guy coming off a serious injury who's getting lots of play.
I just don't get it. I can't get my head around it. You know, I was a big Trey McBride guy coming out, but I just can't get my head around it. You're a team that's going nowhere. You've got a guy that's going nowhere. Why not try and, develop the guy you've got? But yeah, we'll leave it and move on rather than me get more frustrated. San Francisco against the Rams, a 44.5 point over under. This feels, Tom, like this could be a really, really exciting matchup that you want pieces of.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, these divisional matchups have always been fun. I think, obviously, the Niners look set for another deep playoff run this year. The Rams, I'm still not convinced that the Rams don't end up in the mix for a wild card spot because the NFC is just so bad. What people saw last week was a much pluckier, much more interesting Rams offense than expected. I think this will be a much sterner test. You look at what Puka Nacua, Tutu Atwell, Tyler Higbee are going to come up against in the Niners defense. It's far more difficult. Kyren Williams, I mean, hey, try telling people all offseason that Kyren Williams was going to be more of a problem for Cam Akers than people wanted to hear. And then Akers, yes, he ended up with 22 touches, but he got 12 of them in the fourth quarter. He had 29 yards total on 22 touches. Meanwhile, in the first half, Kyren Williams outtouched him 26-4. If any of the running backs are going to have any value from the Rams side this week, it's going to be Kyren Williams when the Rams are in hurry up, having to, come from behind. And it seems that Kyren Williams has the passing down role. So I don't mind starting him. I think if you've gone out and if you spent a huge amount of your waiver bid on Puka Nacua, as we've seen some crazy ones. I've seen high stakes leagues where he went for 100% of waiver bids and stuff like that. So if you did that, then you've got to have enough faith in him to start him right now. In terms of the Niners side, CMC, I was a little bit off CMC at times this offseason because I thought Elijah Mitchell might play. We saw last year that even in games where CMC was there, Elijah Mitchell had games where he'd come in and he'd take some snaps. That just didn't happen last week, which is making me feel slightly nervous. Deebo, he had 2 deep targets. It seems like he's kind of back to playing wide receiver in a pure wide receiver way, as well as mixing in for those occasional rushes. Brandon Ayuk absolutely looks completely legit. So George Kittle, I mean, we've been out on him all offseason. I just worry about him. He played 46 of 66 snaps last week, and he can probably have success against this Rams defense. Maybe you can mix him in for a DFS lineup, but if you're starting him in redraft, I'm definitely looking to add somebody behind him so I start finding that parachute for when I need to get out.
Yeah, I think the thing you've brushed over there, Tom, watching the film, this might be the most impressive game I've ever seen Matt Stafford play, which feels slightly hyperbolic from a guy that had one of the best playoff runs and was an absolute superstar and has had some phenomenal games. What he did last Sunday was absolutely mind-blowing. He was incredible. I can't speak highly enough. And I think that, yes, Tutu Atwell and Puka Nacua were fantastic and, they're great and hopefully they can continue. But to me, I'm more excited about this entire Rams offense moving forward because of what Matt Stafford did last week. If he can continue that on, we've got up on the screen here his next gen stats. You can see he was spreading the ball all over the place. He had over a 13% big time throw rate according to PFF. It was absolutely mind-blowingly good.
but he's moving so well as well, isn't he? Like, he looks slimmer. He's moving around nicely. He's getting the ball out and he's throwing in those no-look passes. Like, Matthew Stafford's ADP never made sense this offseason unless you really thought he was going to end up retiring mid-season. And that just isn't what most of these compares do when the ball actually gets into play. Like, I'm still hopeful that this Rams offense can keep churning over. So by week 5, we get Cooper Kupp back because I definitely need it.
Yeah, I think you and I both need it. A couple of questions in the chat, Tom. So ZU's, I have Tua, Richardson, and Watson at QB. He basically needs an extra roster spot. He could cut Richardson or Deshaun or make a 2-for-1 trade of Hollywood and Swift for Nakua. It's a one quarterback league. To me, in a one quarterback league, there is no way that I'm holding 3 quarterbacks. So I think you can probably cut 2 of them. The fact that you've got 3 good ones, I think, probably shows that there's going to be some good ones on the way to wire next week. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's not something I ever do apart from when there's bye week concerns. And I think Anthony Richardson has a week 14 bye or something like that. Deshaun Watson's might be a week 5 or 6. So you could weigh them in slightly, but I'd be fine keeping either Tua.
I'd start Richardson this week. So for me, I'd cut Tua and Watson and just roll with that.
Yeah, I think it's tricky. I'd probably lean towards Richardson, Tua, and Watson in that order. I'm still not convinced outside of Watson's rushing ability that we've seen him really look completely dynamic yet. In terms of a trade or make a 2-for-1 trade, Hollywood and Swift and Nakua, that's 2 players in bad situations, possibly going out to get Nakua. You just have to be comfortable that if Kyler Murray does come back and Marquise Brown ends up being much more fantasy relevant and Nakua's season tails off with Kupp coming back, you have to be comfortable with that. But I don't hate it, particularly if you're just looking to move players off your roster rather than keeping those clogs.
Yeah, I don't love that trade. I'll be honest. I feel like it's moving deck chairs on the Titanic, quite frankly. And then the next question: do you think I should try a trade of giving up Garrett Wilson, Etienne for AJ Brown and Ramondre? He also has Mixon, so he probably wouldn't do that. To me, Ramondre better than Etienne, AJ Brown better than Garrett Wilson. This is an absolute smash.
Yeah, 100% agreed. And yeah, if you're here and if we've been answering your question, make sure you hit that like button down below.
The next matchup, slightly less exciting than perhaps we hoped from Sam Howell last week, but okay from a fantasy point of view. Washington versus Denver, another low over-under at 39. Are you hopeful? I mean, 99% of the cash is currently on the under, Tom. I think this over-under is going to come down as we get to game day. Do you want any part of this game?
So it's definitely not a sexy play, but I can talk myself into Brian Robinson if I needed to start him in a league where you've kind of faded running back early on. Last week, he had a career-high 72% opportunity share against the Cardinals, which is 10% more than he ever got last year. Antonio Gibson is Robinson's main competition for snaps, but he had 4 touches last week. He fumbled. Brian Robinson had 20 touches. So it's entirely possible that this job just does belong to Brian Robinson. I think if you're looking at the passing game, Sam Howell, he did okay last week. He definitely didn't do fantastic. If Terry McLaurin gets shadowed by Patrick Surtain, who shadowed Devontae Adams last week, is one of the best cornerbacks in the league, then that might open up an avenue for Jahan Dotson to have a slightly better game. So if you're talking DFS tournaments, I don't mind starting Dotson as a bit of a dart throw. There's nobody on the Broncos whatsoever that I would start. I think, Javonte and P. Ryan, it's a clear timeshare. Marvin Mims, who I definitely had high hopes for last week, played him in a few lineups. He ended up running the seventh amount of routes in a game, which was really poor. Even Sam Howell, I'm not going back to the well with him because I think we were kind of hoping that he'd have a bit more rushing opportunity. And last week he had 11 rushing yards. He had 1 touchdown on the ground, which did help, but he only had 15 PPR points. When he was 4,900 last week, that was one thing, but now he's 5,400. You start to need more about 17, 18 points from your quarterback at that price range on DraftKings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing, Jerry Jeudy, there's no way I'm touching him. I know they said that he could have played last Sunday. There's no way I'm touching him first week off a hamstring injury. That's always the kind of person that I avoid. I love the point about Brian Robinson. I think this is his backfield. It pains me to say it as a guy that's got quite a lot of Antonio Gibson best ball shares that are probably going to do nothing for me, but a guy that I think is a worse rusher than Brian Robinson. He wasn't adding anything in the receiving game. He can't stop fumbling the ball. So yeah, I think wheels up for Brian Robinson as an RB2 in redraft and dynasty, but probably not got that spike ceiling for me in DFS. I don't know if you'd agree, Tom.
Yeah, very much so. I think he's possibly more of the kind of play for cash games than tournaments. I think for Brian Robinson to ever get there to where you need him to be in tournaments, he probably needs 3 touchdowns, which, I'm not sure this Commanders offense is ever going to score 3 touchdowns with running backs in one game.
Absolutely. The next matchup, I feel like I'm going to do this through tiers, but the Jets versus Dallas, we've seen the over-under go all over the place, Tom. I've got it now at 39.5, with the Jets having the lowest implied team total of the week at 15. Not sure I can get on board with starting any Jets player, but is there anyone else you fancy in this matchup?
I mean, Breece Hall looked fantastic, didn't he? I mean, you look back at his game log and the amount of plays where he was just absolutely breaking huge amounts of runs was definitely very impressive. So I can understand starting Breece Hall. I mean, at 5,900, we're still getting a discount. These prices came out before the game for the Jets on was it Monday night. So I can understand playing Breece Hall. In terms of Garrett Wilson, it was brutal last year when he played with Zach Wilson. He had 9.3 PPR points in games with Zach Wilson and 17.3 without. That touchdown last week was incredible. Easily one of the best touchdowns I've seen in a long time. But yeah, it's much easier to look at the Cowboys side of things, where Tony Pollard, he had 7 red zone rush attempts, which leads the league, 4 inside the 5-yard line. That's what Tony Pollard, truth, has been crying out for years now, for him to get that work with Zeke Elliott, looking washed. So that was incredibly encouraging. I think if you took Tony Pollard on the 1-2 turn, you've really got to feel very pleased about that. Jake Ferguson, he had 5 targets inside the red zone, 7 targets total. That was definitely noteworthy. He didn't do an awful lot with them, but perhaps this week he might end up with a slightly better opportunity on those targets.
I think,
and then the last,
if I can dive in there, Tom, sorry, during your flow, I think the Jets are also terrible against tight ends. Their linebackers can't cover. They're notoriously bad against tight ends. And I think that Jake Ferguson could be a really good, solid, sneaky play if he gets that red zone work as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's, as you said, like the cornerbacks are such a strength. The safeties, that's where the Jets are going to be, taking players away. So, I mean, I've been high on Michael Gallup all off season, and then it was rather disappointing to see him have a very quiet start to the season. But Brandon Cooks is dealing with a sprained MCL knee injury, so it's possible he might miss. If that happens, I could possibly talk myself into Michael Gallup, but really, it's Tony Pollard and Jake Ferguson for me, possibly Breece Hall, and that's about it in this game.
Yeah, I think before we move on to next matchup, I just want to flash up this graph that Ian Hartich showed, just to cheer me up. Look at that, Breece Hall in a world of his own in terms of yards after contact. Before we dive into the next matchup, which is Miami versus New England, we've got another question in the chat, Tom. Full PPR, pick 2 to start: Mattison, Ayuk, Algier, Mostert, Herbert.
I mean, for me, it's Mattison and Ayuk quite easily.
Yeah, I think maybe I could be talked to Mostert over Mattison, but I think, Mattison and Ayuk is probably the 2 to start. And then one more question. Dotson, Flowers, Zay Jones, or Elijah Moore, pick 1.
I mean, I'm going to go with Zay Flowers. I think that if we're projecting that game to be a pass-heavy, pass funnel sort of game. I don't think the Bengals defense is particularly good this season. We lost key players. The Ravens defense is going to be miserable. We saw Zay Flowers' usage last week. I think you can kind of book in double-digit points there with him.
Yeah, I agree. I've just checked my rankings and I'd go Zay Flowers. I've got him ahead of the other three, so agreed. Miami, New England's. Miami obviously incredible last week. We saw that offense be everything it was at the start of last year, but Bill Belichick's serious defensive mind, could he be the one that finally slows down Tyreek, Tua, and potentially Jalen Waddle?
It'll be very interesting. I think, he probably understands defense in a way that most people just can't even fathom. So if he can find a chink in the armor of Mike McDaniels, then it will be very interesting. This Miami team, they just picked up where they left off when Tua was healthy last year. 466 passing yards is just absolutely absurd. Tyreek Hill, 215 yards and 2 touchdowns. It was just incredible the way that the plays were going. Like, he was sprinting at the line of scrimmage as the ball would be snapped, and he would just be impossible for the defenders to cover.
It was like watching Canadian football.
I think you can feel good about Tyreek Hill. Jalen Waddle has an oblique injury, but he seems to pick up all these kind of little niggling injuries and just play through them. I don't think last week was a great week for him, but I think if the Patriots look to take Tyreek Hill away or try and limit him, then that only spells good things for Jalen Waddle, because this Patriots defense, they allowed like the 6th highest catch rate to wide receivers last week against the Eagles. They don't have the depth at cornerback and safety that they used to do. I don't think they're as imposing there. So I'd be fine playing Waddle in DFS. This one is I think it's a Sunday night game. So, we're talking DFS showdown. In terms of the tight ends, there's probably quite a bit of interest in this game and what you can do with the tight ends. Hunter Henry played 72% of snaps compared to Mike Gesicki's 41%, and Hunter Henry had an 11% target share. It just seems like everything's stacked up for Hunter Henry to be the tight end one of this offense, unless Mike Gesicki can wrestle it away from him. On the other side of it, Durham Smythe getting 7 targets was slightly surprising. That wasn't what anybody necessarily expected, but part of that I think comes down to the fact that the Dolphins were just so pass happy last week. They were really slinging the ball. They only rushed the ball something like 13 times in the entire game with running backs. I wouldn't be overly excited to start Raheem Mostert in this one, but I think you can. Apparently yesterday he missed practice. It was only because of a veteran rest day. He's okay. But Rich, why don't you talk to me about Kendrick Bourne? Your guy, you deserve the victory laps here.
Yeah, no, you know that I love Kendrick Bourne, and yeah, it was potentially the last man standing, wasn't it? We seen Devontae Parker was injured, Juju Smith-Schuster's, I don't know if he's in the doghouse or it's his knee. He didn't look healthy running routes, but Kendrick Bourne, I thought he showed great command of both sort of route running ability, understanding the offense, but also really good connection with Mac Jones. And I think that, to me, I think you've got to invest in it, because I don't think there's anybody that's going to take target snaps away from him. And this Patriots offense is playing fast, like it's fastest in the league through week 1. I'm really excited about what this could be. And I think he's a really sneaky, potentially wide receiver 3 for kind of the rest of the season. The player we've not talked about, though, Ramondre Stevenson, we saw at the start of the game, Zeke got an awful lot of kind of schemed up manufactured touches on the first 2 drives and then seems to disappear. We were both very big fans of Stevenson in the offseason. Are you concerned, or do you think that this is going to be Ramondre's backfield moving forward?
It's Ramondre's backfield. I think, this is one where the Patriots, even during the offseason, they had Ramondre at times not practicing because they wanted to keep him fresh. So they're very careful about how much they're going to lean on him. And there might be games where it kind of goes away from Ramondre Stevenson. But Zeke didn't look incredible with his usage. He definitely wasn't making a case for him to be the RB1 in this offense. So no, I'm completely fine with it. It's going to be tricky at times, but if you drafted Ramondre Stevenson in redraft, It's probably your RB1, RB2 at the most. And you've got to have a little bit of faith in that talent, the ability to break those explosive plays that we saw last year.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a few questions in the chat. We'll dive through quickly before we get to the Monday night games. So, full point PPR need 3 of George Pickens, DeAndre Swift, Elijah Moore, Addison, Dobbs, or London. Where are you going here, Tom?
It's not Swift. It's not Dobbs. I think Addison I'd be starting Pickens, and probably a toss-up between Elijah Moore and Drake London.
Yeah, I think I'd go London over Moore, but I could understand after last week potentially going with against London there. The next question, should I flex Zay Flowers, Judy, McLaurin, or Puka?
I mean, this Lamar Jackson jersey behind me is definitely not doing any favor for my impartiality, but I go Flowers because I think Judy off the hamstring is a really dangerous proposition. Terry McLaurin, we talked about it earlier. I think he could get a lot of coverage from Patrick Surtain. And then Puka, I think that Niners pass defense is, they're no fools. So I'd possibly be going for Flowers if I felt like I needed a bit of secure points. If you want to shoot for the moon, then it's probably Puka or McLaurin.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you 100% here, Tom. Judy, I know that he's practicing fully. I know that he's supposedly back healthy. There's no way I'm touching him first week off a hamstring injury. They notoriously repeat. Terry McLaurin, as you said, Patrick Surtain, and also the toe injury. I don't want to touch him. And I think that Zay Flowers is a better play than Puka this week. So, yeah, I'd go Zay Flowers here. And then final one, Ertz or Njoku. Got to be Njoku, right?
Yeah, I'm going with Njoku. I think Zach Ertz might be a volume accumulator. He's going to pick up volume because they need to get the ball out quickly, and he'll be near the line of scrimmage because Zach Ertz can't get far enough away from the line of scrimmage. But going back to the Giants, Wing Martindale, he loves to blitz. And if you think that he's not going to see that Cardinals offensive line and a QB3 in Josh Dobbs and not go, okay, I'm just going to send the house at them and give them absolute nightmares, I can't have any faith in that Cardinal side to be able to keep moving the ball. So for me, it's easily Njoku.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll dive into the Monday night matchups, but we'll keep them reasonably quick here, Tom, because there's no DFS. The Saints, they moved the ball all over the field, but really struggled in the red zone. Do you think that it could be an issue for them moving forward, or do you think there's going to be enough potential point scoring that all the mouths could continue to eat in New Orleans?
It's very much going to depend on how much Derek Carr can really keep the Saints offense cooking at times. Last week, Michael Thomas had 3 red zone targets, but this all kind of came at expense of running game, which was dreadful. Jamal Williams had 2.5 yards per carry. He had 18 rush attempts and only 45 yards on it, only 1 run over 6 yards. So I think the passing game is going to succeed when the running game isn't succeeding. We saw Taysom Hill last week. He played the second fewest snaps he's done since the start of last season. So it's not like they're suddenly forcing Taysom Hill in there because the running game wasn't succeeding. So Rashid Shaheed, I don't mind starting him in your flex. I don't mind starting Michael Thomas if you need to. I still think that there's a chance that the Michael Thomas thing could go badly this year. And obviously, if you've got Chris Olave, you start him, and we both love Juwan Johnson.
Yeah, and then over at Carolina, I had a tweet earlier in the week about how basically there's no Carolina wide receivers that can win early, which means Bryce Young's having to hold the ball. You can see on the screen there, average time to throw of 3.21. That's from a guy that doesn't scramble very much as well. Miles Sanders was second in the league last week in weighted opportunities. Do you think that there's any part of this Carolina offense that you want to be starting week in, week out?
In my home league, I've got to start Miles Sanders. I'm in a bit of a ropey running back situation, and I've got to. So I do think you can start him if you want. I mean, Chuba Hubbard is slightly more efficient in some ways and offers a bit better, probably pass catching. But Miles Sanders, I've got some level of faith in. It's just going to be boom or bust. You're going to need him to score touchdowns. And if you don't have to, then yeah, you can probably look for other options. Aside from that, yeah, we didn't see Jonathan Mingo do anything particularly good. We didn't see anyone as a wide receiver. Hayden Hurst had a nice day. And I think if you need Hayden Hurst whilst you're waiting on one of these rookie tight ends to develop and let you know what you've got in a rookie tight end on your bench, I don't mind starting Hayden Hurst this week.
Yeah, so we've got 2 more questions in the chat before we get to the final matchup. Zed Money says, I have Jefferson versus the Eagles, CeeDee Lamb versus the Jets, and Pickens versus the Browns. I'm nervous. Don't be nervous. You got studs. Start your studs. Be confident.
The Eagles cornerbacks and safeties, they're not what they were last year. James Bradbury's going to miss that game. CeeDee Lamb, we'll see him kind of be moved around and cycled in and out of the slot. It'll be fine. And then George Pickens should probably get the most targets he's ever had if Matt Canada can get out of his own way.
I think the CeeDee Lamb point's great. You know, the Jets, yeah, they've got 2 elite corners. They've got great safety tandem, but Michael Carter in the slot is the weak link, and we're going to see CeeDee Lamb moved all over the place to line up there. Hayden says, sit 2 this week. Javonte, Hall, Sanders, Dotson, Algier. For me, it's Javonte and Algier. Do you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree with that one. Yep.
Yeah, and then final question. Who do we like in a 0.5 PPR flex? Terry McLaurin, Puka, or Jordan Addison with 2 Eagles secondary players out?
It's Jordan Addison for me.
Just quickly checking my rankings. Yeah, it's Jordan Addison for me as well. So yeah, I'd go with him. So the final matchup of the week, we've got a double Monday night header. It's Cleveland versus Pittsburgh. Again, relatively low over-under at 40. 96% of the cash is on the under, Tom. Are you excited about anyone in this matchup particularly?
I'm excited to see what happens with George Pickens. Do we see his route tree? Do we see it expanded? Because that has been the big knock. Matt Canada hasn't diversified what George Pickens is doing. Last week, he was running the same kind of down the sideline. He wasn't really getting involved in ways that he wasn't last year. So I'm excited to see George Pickens because I'm definitely not a George Pickens truther. I'm, somebody that I got on board with it in DFS because the price felt okay. And now I'm feeling slightly better about that because I had plenty of Deontay Johnson as well. So it's taking the edge off that. So that's definitely something I like. I think I'm intrigued to see what Nick Chubb looks like because we saw him have 4 receptions last week. In week 18, he also had 4 receptions when playing with Deshaun Watson. Before that, you go back 3 years since he last had 4 receptions in a game. So are we going to continue to see that kind of usage from him? Deshaun Watson, we got the stat there up on screen. 41 carries in his last 7 games. It feels very easy to just book him for 5 to 6 scrambles or design rushes per game, which is going to help elevate his floor. I'm still not convinced that he's going to be the fantasy asset that he once was. But I think if we get that, then it does keep him in that kind of back end QB1 conversation every week. And then the Steelers running back situation. I've been bashing on Najee Harris for months. I mean, he's not an exciting running back, but I didn't expect to see Jaylen Warren tie with 8 touches with him in the first week of the season. Part of that maybe it was because the Niners were just dominating them and they weren't able to get anything going. And it wasn't like Jaylen Warren looked incredible last week. But in a game which probably projects to be a bit closer, what does that backfield usage look like? Because if we start seeing Jaylen Warren creep ahead of Najee Harris, I'm going to be a very happy man for my best ball bags.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'd love to mention that I'm a bit concerned about is Amari Cooper kept leaving the field last week. Now, yes, it was potentially injury related, but he also was left the field once he returned in a lot of 2 wide receiver sets. He only played 62.2% of the snaps. He didn't run a huge amount of routes. If that's a trend that's going to continue, his fantasy production is likely going to reduce. So from a dynasty perspective, if that trend continues this week, I'm probably getting out and selling as quickly as I can. But that concludes for this week. We've run you through every single relevant matchup. If you've got any more questions, by all means, drop them in the comments below. Tom and I answer every single question that we get. If you're here and you've not hit that thumbs up button, what are you doing? Help us out. Also hit that subscribe. And if you want more of Tom's fantastic DFS content or more of my Dynasty stuff, then hit the join. You can join the Discord and get access to absolutely everything you could ever need. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.